Captain Kevin Harris stood at the viewport of the diplomatic shuttle, watching Earth grow smaller behind him. His reflection stared back from the glass, a man in his mid-40s with weathered features and tired eyes. He had spent 20 years in the military, fighting in places most people would never hear about. Now the fate of the entire human species rested on his shoulders. The weight of it pressed against his chest like a physical thing. The shuttle hummed softly around him as it cut through the darkness of space. Kevin pressed his palm against the cool window, feeling the faint vibration of the engines. Behind the shuttle, 3 smaller military vessels followed at a distance. They were there for protection, though Kevin knew that if things went wrong, no amount of firepower would save them. The Tyrellian Council had been watching humanity for decades. Their sensors, technology far beyond anything humans had yet created, had tracked every weapons test, every military exercise, every conflict on Earth's surface. To them, humans looked like a violent, aggressive species spreading chaos and destruction wherever they went. The Council feared that if humanity was allowed to develop space travel freely, they would become a threat to the entire galaxy. For months, human leaders had argued about how to respond. Some wanted to hide, to keep Earth's military capabilities secret. Others wanted to show strength, to demonstrate that humanity was not a species to be trifled with. Kevin believed in a different approach. He believed in honesty and connection. He believed that if he could make the aliens understand what humans really were, beyond the weapons and the wars, then peace was possible. His team consisted of 5 people, each chosen for their unique skills and perspectives. Lucas Powell was the chief diplomat, a brilliant man with a gift for languages and negotiation. Dr. Sarah Mitchell was a medical officer who had served in conflict zones across the world. Robert Chen was an engineer and technology expert. Maria Rodriguez was a communications specialist. And then there was David Lambert, Kevin's second in command and closest friend. They were all nervous. Kevin could see it in the way they moved through the shuttle, the careful precision of their motions, the slight tension in their voices when they spoke to each other. This mission was unlike anything humanity had ever attempted. They were walking into the unknown, hoping that their words and their humanity would be enough to save their world. The Tyrellian neutral station appeared on the scanner first, a massive structure that hung in space like a city made of light and metal. It was enormous, far larger than anything humanity had ever built. Kevin had studied the data about it for weeks. It could house thousands of different species from hundreds of worlds. It was ancient, maintained and rebuilt over millions of years. To humans, it represented the pinnacle of advancement and civilization. As they approached, Kevin's hand instinctively moved to the communication device at his wrist. He activated it and spoke quietly to his team. His voice was calm, steady, the voice of someone who had faced danger before and survived. He reminded them that they were not soldiers on this mission. They were ambassadors for all of humanity. Every gesture they made, every word they spoke, every action they took would shape how the galaxy saw their species. Lucas nodded from across the shuttle, his face pale but determined. David placed a reassuring hand on Kevin's shoulder. The others checked their equipment one final time. Not weapons, but data tablets and communication devices. They had brought gifts, carefully selected items that represented human creativity and culture. Small sculptures made by artists, recordings of music, photographs of Earth's natural beauty, and technical documents that showed the peaceful applications of human technology. The shuttle began to dock with the station. Through the window, Kevin could see alien vessels of every conceivable shape and size. Some looked organic, as if they had grown rather than been built. Others were sleek and geometric, sharp angles and impossible designs. He had studied files about the different species, but seeing them here, knowing they were real and watching his shuttle approach, made his heart pound. The docking procedure took several minutes. Kevin felt the shuttle shift and settle into place with a soft metallic click. The artificial gravity adjusted slightly, and he felt the momentary sensation of floating before the shuttle's systems recalibrated. This was it, the moment everything would change. Kevin turned to face his team one last time before they disembarked. He saw the fear in their eyes, but he also saw the determination. They were humans. They were adaptable, brave, and fundamentally decent people. If anyone could bridge the gap between humanity and the stars, it would be them. He took a deep breath and moved toward the airlock. The door hissed open, revealing a tunnel that connected the shuttle to the station. Beyond it, he could hear voices and the soft hum of alien technology. His footsteps echoed as he walked forward, each step bringing him closer to the moment that would define human history. As Kevin stepped into the station, the first thing that struck him was the sheer scale of the place. The ceiling stretched up so high he could barely see it. Beings of every conceivable type moved through the corridors. Some flew, some walked on multiple legs. Some seemed to flow across the surfaces like liquid given solid form. The air smelled strange, like ozone and something else he could not quite identify. A delegation of Tyrellian representatives waited to receive them. They were tall, roughly humanoid in shape, but with skin that seemed to shimmer with an internal light. Their eyes were large and dark with no visible pupils. They wore clothing that appeared to be part of their bodies, woven from materials that looked both organic and technological. The lead representative stepped forward. His name, Kevin had been told, was Lord Zephyr. He was ancient by Tyrellian standards, over 400 years old, though he looked perhaps 40 in human terms. His presence was commanding, and Kevin felt the weight of his attention like a physical force. Lord Zephyr did not smile. Tyrellians did not smile in the way humans did, but he extended his hand in what Kevin recognized as a gesture of greeting that had been deliberately taught to humans in preparation for this meeting. Kevin stepped forward and clasped the alien's hand. The skin was warm and smooth, and Kevin felt a brief tingle that might have been some kind of biological scanner reading his DNA. Lord Zephyr's voice, when he spoke, came through a translation device that Kevin wore at his ear. The words came out in clear, precise English, but with a cadence that was definitely not human. He welcomed Kevin and his team to the station, but his tone was not warm. It was formal, polite, but edged with something that might have been suspicion or contempt. As Kevin was led down the corridor toward the negotiation chamber, he could feel the eyes of dozens of different species watching them pass. This was the moment humanity had been waiting for. This was first contact on the grand stage of the galaxy. And Kevin knew that in the hours and days to come, his words and actions would either open the door to a bright future for humanity or close it forever. The fate of 8 billion people rested on what happened next. The negotiation chamber was designed to be neutral, a space that no single species could claim as their own. The walls were a soft metallic gray, and the lighting was calibrated to be comfortable for multiple species' visual ranges. A large circular table dominated the center of the room, with seats arranged around it. Kevin noted that the chairs were not uniform. They were designed in different configurations to accommodate different body types. Humans got chairs that were similar to what they used back on Earth. Lucas Powell took the lead as chief diplomat. He began with the traditional greeting that had been agreed upon, speaking words of peace in the hope that the two species could understand each other. His voice was steady and eloquent, and Kevin felt a surge of confidence. Lucas was good at this. He had been trained for exactly this kind of moment. But as Lucas continued, Kevin began to notice that Lord Zephyr and the other Tyrellian representatives were growing increasingly tense. Their posture stiffened and their large dark eyes seemed to narrow. One of the younger Tyrellians made a sound that the translator rendered as a harsh, discordant note. Lucas paused, confused by the reaction. He looked at Kevin, seeking guidance. Kevin held up a hand, asking for a moment. He had trained for this, for the possibility that something would go wrong. He had studied human psychology and the little that was known about Tyrellian psychology. But nothing had quite prepared him for this. Lord Zephyr stood abruptly. The movement was sharp and sudden, and Kevin immediately recognized it as an aggressive gesture. His military training kicked in and he moved without thinking. He stood as well, but slowly, deliberately, keeping his hands visible and empty. He did not want the Tyrellians to see the movement as threatening. When Lord Zephyr spoke, his voice was harder now, the translation device rendering his words as sharp and pointed. He told Kevin that humanity was not welcome at this table. He explained that the Tyrellian Council had reviewed all available data about the human species, and they had found it to be fundamentally unstable and dangerous. He pointed to images that appeared on screens around the room. They showed military installations on Earth, weapons tests, and satellite images of war-torn regions. One image in particular caught everyone's attention. It was a video of a human military exercise, a simulation where soldiers practiced rapid deployment and combat operations. To human eyes, it was routine military training. To Lord Zephyr and the other Tyrellians, it looked like organized violence in preparation for conquest. Lucas tried to explain, but his words seemed to only make things worse. The other Tyrellian representatives made more of those harsh sounds. One of them gestured, and suddenly the chamber was filled with armed guards. They were humanoid but obviously modified for combat. Their skin was thick and armor-like, and they carried weapons that Kevin could only describe as advanced beyond anything humanity possessed. Kevin's team instinctively moved closer together. David's hand went to his side where he carried a stunner weapon, similar to human security devices. Kevin caught his eye and shook his head slightly. If David reached for that weapon, it would be the end. The Tyrellians would interpret it as the beginning of an attack. Lord Zephyr spoke again, his voice cold and final. He declared that the human delegation was in violation of the preliminary peace agreements by bringing weapons to the negotiation chamber. The guards began to move forward. Kevin could see the fear in his team's faces. Maria stepped backward, her hand shaking. Robert's face was pale. This was the moment, Kevin realized. This was the exact moment that would define everything. In the next few seconds, he would either make a terrible mistake or do something that might save them all. He thought of Earth, of the 8 billion people counting on him. He thought of David and his family back home. He thought of all the humans who had died in wars, searching for peace and never finding it. Kevin took a breath. Then he did something that neither the Tyrellians nor his own team expected. He reached down slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and visible. He unclasped the holster that held his weapon. The stunner was a state-of-the-art device, the most advanced piece of military technology humans possessed. It represented human power and human defense capability. It also represented everything the Tyrellians feared about humanity. He removed the weapon slowly and held it out, extending his arm fully. Every eye in the room was on him. The guards paused in their advance. Lord Zephyr's expression changed, though Kevin could not quite read what the emotion was. Then Kevin did something that shocked everyone. He walked forward toward the center of the chamber and placed the weapon on the floor. He did not drop it dramatically. He laid it down gently, as if it were something precious and fragile. Then he stepped back, turned to face Lord Zephyr, and raised both his hands, palms open and facing outward. The gesture was universal. It meant surrender. It meant vulnerability. It meant trust. It meant the absence of weapons and the presence of peaceful intent. Humans had used this gesture for thousands of years, across every culture and every continent. It was the most basic statement of non-aggression that a human being could make. The chamber fell silent. The guards did not move. Lord Zephyr stared at Kevin, his large dark eyes studying the human captain with an intensity that Kevin could feel like a physical pressure. Then Lord Zephyr made a sound. It was not the harsh, discordant note of the other Tyrellians. It was different, and for a moment Kevin wondered if he had just made a terrible mistake. Maybe he had misread the situation. Maybe the gesture meant something entirely different to the Tyrellians. But then Lord Zephyr raised his own hand and the guards stepped back. The tension in the room did not disappear entirely, but it shifted, changed into something different. It was no longer the tension of immediate violence. It was the tension of uncertainty, of a moment hanging between disaster and possibility. Lord Zephyr gestured toward the table. When he spoke, his voice was different. The translation device rendered it with less harshness, more like curiosity. He told Kevin that they would talk. Not as enemies, not as allies, but as two species who did not understand each other and had much to learn. It was not a victory, but it was not a defeat either. It was a beginning. Kevin sat at the table, his hands folded in front of him. The weapon he had surrendered lay on a table nearby, carefully preserved by the Tyrellians as evidence of the strange gesture the human captain had made. He could feel his team's eyes on him, their relief mixed with concern about what would happen next. Lord Zephyr sat across from Kevin, his large dark eyes fixed on the human's face. There was no translation device between them now. Kevin's earpiece was active, translating in real time, so his words would be rendered into the Tyrellian language and the languages of the other species present. Kevin began to speak. He did not use the formal diplomatic language that Lucas had prepared. Instead, he spoke as a person, not as a representative of government or military power. He told Lord Zephyr about his childhood, about growing up in a world where conflict was common and peace was hard to find. He described his first day in the military, how scared he had been, how he had believed that serving his country was a way to protect people he loved. As he spoke, Kevin watched Lord Zephyr's expression shift. The Tyrellian leader did not interrupt. He simply listened. Kevin could see something in those large, dark eyes, a kind of attention that went beyond simple curiosity. It was the attention of someone truly trying to understand another being. Kevin told stories. He described a time when he was injured in combat, saved by a medic who risked his own life to carry Kevin to safety. He talked about the soldiers under his command, how he had learned that leadership was not about giving orders but about caring for the people you were responsible for. He spoke about the fear that came with combat, the visceral terror of facing death, and the way humans found courage not by being fearless but by acting despite their fear. Dr. Sarah Mitchell began to speak as well. She described performing surgery on both human soldiers and enemy combatants, the way the medical oath transcended nationality and allegiance. She talked about watching people suffer, about losing patience, despite her best efforts, and about the drive that kept her going even when the weight of that loss threatened to break her spirit. Robert Chen explained how the military technology that the Tyrellians feared was actually designed to protect. He described how the same technologies that could kill could also heal, how rocket engines that could deliver weapons could also deliver medicine and food to people in need. He talked about the hospitals that had been built with military engineering expertise and the lives saved through technology. Maria Rodriguez shared recordings of human music. She played a simple melody, a song that had been sung by humans for centuries, adapted and reinterpreted in countless ways across countless cultures. The music filled the chamber with a sound that was universal in its emotional content. Even beings from completely different biology could feel the emotion embedded in the sound waves. As the hours passed, something began to change in the chamber. Other Tyrellian representatives began to ask questions. They wanted to understand more. They wanted to know why humans fought wars, why they were driven to conflict. Kevin answered honestly. He did not pretend that humans were perfect, or that they had always chosen peace. He admitted the flaws in human nature, the capacity for violence and cruelty that existed within the human spirit. But he also talked about the other side. He described humans running into burning buildings to save strangers. He talked about people who dedicated their lives to helping others, who worked in poor regions of the world with no payment and no recognition. He spoke of parents who sacrificed everything for their children, of friends who stood by each other through unbearable hardship, of entire communities coming together in the aftermath of disaster. One of the younger Tyrellians, a female named Lesa, asked Kevin a direct question. She wanted to know if Kevin believed that humans were capable of changing, of moving away from violence and toward peace. Kevin was quiet for a moment before answering. He thought about Earth, about all the conflicts that humans had overcome, about the progress that had been made. He told Lisa that humans were always changing. It was perhaps the defining characteristic of the species. Humans did not evolve physically the way many other species did, but they evolved culturally and socially. They made mistakes, learned from them, and tried to do better. Some succeeded and some failed, but the attempt, the drive to improve, was constant, and with each generation, humans became more capable of empathy and understanding. As Kevin finished speaking, he could see something different in Lord Zephyr's expression. The suspicion that had been there at the beginning was gone. In its place was something that Kevin had not expected to see. It was respect. It was not the respect that came from fear or power, but the respect that came from recognizing something true and honest in another being. Lord Zephyr stood slowly. The other Tyrellians and the representatives of the other species that had been observing the conversation also stood. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, Kevin realized. The Tyrellians were acknowledging that humans were not the threat they had believed them to be. They were acknowledging that humanity had something valuable to contribute to the galaxy, but it was still too early to know if this would change the official position of the Tyrellian Council. The negotiation chamber had been private, only inhabited by representatives who were open to understanding. The real test would come when Kevin and his team had to face the full council. 3 days later, Kevin stood in the grand amphitheater of the Tyrellian station, preparing for what might be the most important moment of his life. The amphitheater was enormous, carved from a material that seemed to be both metal and stone. Beings of every conceivable type filled the tiered seats that rose up toward a ceiling so high it seemed to disappear into infinity. There were hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, representatives from species across the galaxy. At the center of the amphitheater was a platform where Kevin and his team would speak. But Lord Zephyr had suggested something different from the formal presentations that had been planned. Instead of more speeches and data presentations, he had proposed a cultural exchange. Kevin had agreed immediately, knowing instinctively that this was the right approach. Kevin's team had worked frantically to prepare. They had brought instruments from Earth, including a classical guitar that Kevin had learned to play years ago as a way to calm his mind during his service. They had gathered recordings of human music, visual presentations of human art and culture, and physical objects that represented human creativity and human values. As Kevin walked onto the platform, carrying his guitar, he saw some of the assembled alien representatives lean forward with curiosity. Many of them had never seen a human before. For them, this was first contact, just as it was for Kevin and his team. Kevin sat on a stool and looked out at the crowd. His hands were steady as he raised the guitar. He began to play a piece he had learned long ago, a melody that was simple but deeply emotional. The music filled the amphitheater, and as it did, Kevin could see the effect it was having on the assembled aliens. Some seemed to sway slightly. Others moved their appendages or extremities in rhythm with the music. When the piece ended, Kevin set the guitar down and began to speak. He did not read from prepared remarks. Instead, he spoke directly as one being to many others across the gulf of biology and evolution and experience. He acknowledged that humanity was young, that humans had made mistakes, that they still had much to learn. But he also spoke of the potential that he saw in his species. He talked about the artists and musicians, the scientists and engineers, the healers and teachers who made up human civilization. He talked about the beauty of human creativity, the way humans found meaning in art and music and connection with others. One by one, Kevin's team came forward and shared their own skills and knowledge. Dr. Mitchell showed medical techniques that had saved countless lives. Robert demonstrated engineering solutions to problems that affected multiple species. Maria played recordings of human voices singing in many different languages, all expressing similar emotions despite the linguistic differences. And then something remarkable happened. Some of the other species represented in the amphitheater came forward and began to share their own cultural elements. A Velaron musician played an instrument that created sounds and frequencies that the human ear could barely perceive, but that filled everyone present with a sense of wonder. A crystalline being that communicated, through light patterns, demonstrated art that was literally made from manipulated photons and energy fields. Kevin realized in that moment that this was what Lord Zephyr had hoped would happen. This was not about humans proving themselves to be worthy of the galaxy. This was about showing that all species, regardless of their biology or their evolutionary history, shared something fundamental. They all had the capacity to create, to feel emotion, to connect with others who were different from themselves. As the cultural exchange continued into the evening cycles of the station, Kevin found himself in conversation with representatives of different species. A Draxian officer, a warrior from a species that had conquered numerous worlds through military might, asked Kevin how humans managed to make peace with their aggressive nature. Kevin gave an honest answer. He said that humans did not manage it well, that violence and aggression were still present in human society, but that humans were learning slowly and painfully that there were better ways. A crystalline sage, an ancient being whose species had existed for millions of years, asked Kevin what humans wanted from the galaxy. Kevin thought carefully before answering. He said that humans wanted the same thing that all species wanted. They wanted to survive, to thrive, to explore and understand the universe. But more than that, they wanted to do it together, in cooperation with other species, not in isolation or competition. By the time the cultural exchange ended, Kevin could feel that something fundamental had shifted. The aliens looked at humans differently now. They did not see them as a threat to be contained or a curiosity to be studied. They saw them as fellow beings, worthy of respect and partnership. Lord Zephyr approached Kevin as the gathering was dispersing. The ancient Tyrellian leader placed a hand on Kevin's shoulder in a gesture that Kevin now understood was a sign of respect and affection among the Tyrellians. Lord Zephyr told Kevin that he would speak to the full council. He told Kevin that he believed humanity deserved a place in the galactic community, not out of charity or fear, but out of genuine recognition of their potential and their value. The Grand Hall of the Tyrellian Council was a place of power and authority. The chamber was ancient, maintained and rebuilt over millions of years, and every wall, every pillar, every decorative element told a story of the Tyrellian civilization's long and complex history. Kevin stood before the assembled council, along with his team and representatives from a dozen other species. Lord Zephyr stood to present his recommendation. His voice, rendered through the universal translation system, carried weight and authority. He described the encounter with humanity and how his initial assumptions had been proven wrong. He spoke of Kevin's honesty and vulnerability, of the way a single human had managed to bridge the gap between two species through simple, genuine communication. But more than that, he spoke of humanity's potential. He described the stories of human sacrifice and courage that Kevin had shared. He talked about the cultural exchange and how humans had demonstrated their capacity for art and creativity that was equal to any species present. He made the case that humanity, far from being a threat to the galaxy, was a species that could make significant contributions to galactic civilization. There was debate. Some council members remained skeptical. An ancient Zix representative, a species that had been burned by younger species in the past, questioned whether giving humanity access to the galaxy might not result in human pirates and traders causing problems throughout settled space. A Plutonian delegate raised concerns about human reproduction rates and whether they might eventually overwhelm other species through sheer population growth. Kevin was given an opportunity to address these concerns. He stood, and his voice was calm and measured as he responded to each objection. He acknowledged that humans were capable of becoming a problem if given unlimited access to the galaxy. But he suggested that perhaps the solution was not isolation but partnership, cooperation, and shared responsibility. He proposed that humans could commit to following galactic laws and treaties, just as every other species did. He suggested that humans had much to learn from older civilizations, and that learning could happen faster if humans were in direct contact with other species rather than developing in isolation. His words seemed to resonate. One by one, council members began to nod or make gestures of acknowledgement. Finally, the head of the council, an ancient being named Chancellor Vera, who was over 10,000 years old, rose to speak. Chancellor Vera acknowledged that humanity presented both risks and opportunities. But she said that the galaxy had always been a place where new species emerged and had to find their place among the established powers. She believed that the best way to manage the risk was not to isolate humanity, but to welcome them into the community and help them learn the ways of galactic civilization. She called for a vote on granting humanity full membership in the Tyrellian Coalition, and by extension, access to the broader galactic community. The vote was not unanimous, but it was overwhelming. The vast majority of council members voted in favor of welcoming humanity. When the final count was announced, Kevin heard cheers from his team members. Maria was crying, tears of relief and joy streaming down her face. David placed a hand on Kevin's shoulder, his face filled with emotion. As the formal ceremony of welcome concluded, Lord Zephyr approached Kevin once more. The ancient Tyrellian leader clasped Kevin's hand, and this time the gesture felt warm and full of genuine regard. Lord Zephyr told Kevin that he hoped the two of them would maintain their personal connection across the years to come. He wanted to establish a direct line of communication between himself and Kevin, not as official representatives but as friends. Kevin agreed without hesitation. He told Lord Zephyr that he believed the two of them, despite their differences in biology and culture, had found something rare and valuable. They had found genuine understanding, and he believed that if two individuals from different species could achieve that, then perhaps entire civilizations could as well. Over the following weeks, as Kevin and his team prepared to return to Earth, They worked with Tyrellian officials to establish the framework for ongoing cooperation and trade. It was agreed that Earth would send cultural and technical delegations to the Tyrellian station, and that Tyrellian representatives would establish a permanent embassy on Earth. Kevin spent his last evening on the station with Lord Zephyr, and they talked as friends. Lord Zephyr asked Kevin what he thought the future would hold for humanity. Kevin said he did not know, that the future was never certain, but he said he hoped that humanity would remember this moment, this time when they had opened themselves to the galaxy and been welcomed despite their flaws and their past mistakes. 5 years later, Kevin Harris stood in a classroom at the United Nations Academy for Diplomatic Training in Geneva, Earth. The room was filled with men and women of various ages and backgrounds, all selected for advanced training in interspecies diplomacy. They represented humanity's commitment to developing a cadre of ambassadors and negotiators who could represent their species with skill and integrity. Kevin was no longer a military captain. He had retired from active service and now dedicated himself to training the next generation of human diplomats. His classroom was unlike any traditional educational setting. Large windows looked out over the Swiss Alps, and technology that the Tyrellians had shared with humanity allowed for virtual communication with other species. Sometimes, during lessons, actual alien diplomats would join the class to share their perspectives and experiences. The class was just beginning that morning when Kevin started with a question. He asked his students what they believed was the most important skill for a diplomat. Hands went up immediately. Some students said negotiation skills. Others mentioned knowledge of other cultures. One young woman suggested that understanding human nature and human limitations was most important. Kevin smiled. These were good answers, but they were not the answer he was looking for. He told his students a story, the story of the first diplomatic mission to the Tyrellian Council, and the day he had placed his weapon on the ground and exposed his vulnerability to potential enemies. Kevin explained that the most important skill for a diplomat was the ability to be honest and authentic. He told them that much of traditional diplomacy focused on strategy and positioning, on trying to outmaneuver the other side. But what he had learned through his experience with the Tyrellians was that the most powerful diplomatic tool was simple, genuine truth. He described how the Tyrellians had interpreted human military exercises as evidence of human aggression and ambition. They had been ready to declare humanity a threat and isolate them from the rest of galactic civilization. But when Kevin had been willing to be vulnerable, to share his doubts and his fears as well as his hopes and his values, everything had changed. The aliens had begun to see humans not as faceless enemies, but as individual beings with hopes and dreams similar to their own. One of the students, a man named Christopher, asked Kevin if he had ever been afraid during those first meetings with the Tyrellians. Kevin did not hesitate in answering. He said yes, he had been terrified. He had been afraid that his words would not be enough, that he would say something that would be misinterpreted and lead to conflict. He had been afraid that he was making a mistake that would doom humanity to isolation or worse. But he had also recognized that the fear was not a reason to stop trying. Fear was simply part of the human experience, part of being alive in an uncertain universe. The key was to act despite the fear, to move forward with honesty and integrity even when the outcome was uncertain. Kevin showed his class recordings from the first negotiations with the Tyrellians. He had his students analyze the interactions, looking at not just the words that were spoken but also the subtle body language and emotional currents that had flowed through the chamber. He wanted them to understand that communication was about far more than just language. It was about connecting on a fundamental level, about recognizing the shared humanity in every being regardless of their biology. The class also included practical exercises. Kevin had his students engage in negotiations with virtual representatives of other species, scenarios designed to test their ability to navigate cultural differences and find common ground. Some of the students performed well, able to adjust their communication style and find ways to understand the perspectives of beings who were fundamentally different from themselves. Others struggled, falling back on familiar patterns of diplomacy that did not work when communicating with truly alien minds. Kevin encouraged both the successes and the failures. He told his students that failure was not shameful. It was an opportunity to learn and improve. The most important thing was to remain open, to remain willing to listen and understand, even when the conversation was difficult or when it seemed like the other side was not being receptive. As the weeks progressed, Kevin's students began to understand the philosophy that he was trying to teach them. It was not about winning arguments or dominating negotiations. It was about finding genuine connection across the barriers that separated different species and cultures. It was about recognizing that despite their differences, all sentient beings shared fundamental needs and desires. They all wanted to be understood, to be respected, and to be safe. By the end of the training program, several of Kevin's students would go on to become the ambassadors and diplomats who would represent humanity among the stars. They would carry with them the lessons that Kevin had learned through his own experience. They would face aliens who were suspicious of humanity, just as Lord Zephyr had been. But they would know that through honesty, vulnerability, and genuine effort to understand, it was possible to bridge even the widest gulfs. Kevin stood at the window of his classroom one afternoon, looking out over Earth as he often did. The planet was no longer isolated. Human traders moved through the galaxy, exchanging goods and knowledge with dozens of other species. Human scientists worked alongside aliens to explore the mysteries of the universe. Human artists and musicians were celebrated across hundreds of worlds, and it had all started with one moment, one gesture of vulnerability and trust. Kevin had placed his weapon on the ground and raised his empty hands. He had admitted that humans were not perfect, that they had flaws and made mistakes, but he had also shown that they were capable of growth and change, that they possessed something valuable that the galaxy needed. As Earth's sun set over the Alps, casting the sky in shades of orange and red, Kevin thought about the future. He thought about the young diplomats he was training, who would carry humanity's voice to the stars. He thought about Lord Zephyr, his friend from another world who had chosen to believe in humanity's potential. And he thought about all the humans who would never know the role they had played in humanity's journey to the stars. People whose simple acts of kindness and honesty had contributed to the transformation of their species. The age of human isolation was over. The age of human discovery had only just begun. And Kevin Harris, the Marine who had become a bridge between worlds, knew that the best was yet to come for humanity, and for the galaxy that had embraced them. The stars waited for the species that had finally learned to speak with its whole heart.